Every Linux distribution which is actually usable and could be installed in your primary machine. Here we go. Starting off with the most used distribution of all, which is Debian. Its speciality being it is very stable, and most major distributions in the Linux community is based on Debian. Moving on to the next one, we have Ubuntu, which is probably the most popular distribution of all and is created by a company, Canonical. Its speciality being it is an easier to use, better looking form of Debian. Moving on to the next distribution, Kali Linux is basically also called Hacker's Paradise and mostly used for penetration testing and ethical hacking in general. Its speciality being it can do many stuff which other distributions cannot do, like disguising itself as Windows operating system out of the box, and many more features related to hacking and penetration testing. Next up we have Linux Mint, which is basically Ubuntu but with a different UI. The major selling point of Linux Mint is that it uses multiple desktop environments such as Cinnamon, Mate, Mate, whatever you want to call it, and XFCE, all of them being very popular and all of them not supported officially by Canonical, although Ubuntu has different flavors. Then we have Pop! OS, a distribution made for gamers. Its major specialty being that it supports NVIDIA out of the box and also comes pre-installed in System76 specific hardwares and also some HP hardwares very recently. MX Linux is a Linux distribution directly based on Debian, which does not use systemd yet is a more minimal form of Ubuntu and is also one of those distributions which has ranked the first in distrowatch.com. Next up we have Linux Lite, which is a Linux distribution based on Ubuntu, uses XFCE as its default desktop environment. Its speciality being it could be used easily in older hardwares and looks fairly good. KDE Neon is a Linux distribution developed by the developers of KDE Plasma desktop environment and is a Linux distribution following semi-roll release cycle and is also bleeding edge when it comes to the desktop environment itself. Its speciality being that it shows how vanilla KDE could just do the job for you. Moving on to the next one, we have Zorin OS, a Linux distribution with very good UI, and its speciality being that, well, it's really good in mimicking the interface of Windows and Mac OS using its custom layouts, at the same time adding its own taste of having its own UI and styling. Elementary OS is basically Mac OS but way simpler and easier to use. Its speciality being it's really beginner friendly and could easily pull Mac OS users to Linux. Also, it uses Pantheon Desktop as its default and Pantheon Desktop is really gorgeous. Antix OS is basically made for older computers. It uses minimal window managers like IceWM, etc. Kubuntu is the first official flavor of Ubuntu and it basically uses KDE and follows the exact same release cycle of Ubuntu. Xubuntu is basically Kubuntu but with XFCE. Lubuntu is basically, well, Ubuntu with LXQT. Nitrux Linux provides a completely different user interface yet uses KDE as its default desktop environment. Its major specialty is that it uses app images for its applications. It also has its own applications like the file manager and more. Linux Kodachi is basically a Debian based distribution and yeah, that's it. Parrot OS is another Linux distribution based on the theme of ethical hacking and basically is meant for ethical hackers in general. Slacks Linux is another distribution made for older computers and is completely based off of Debian. AV Linux is a Linux distribution which has its own UI and yeah, again, that's it. Pure OS is another distribution which is not made using systemd and has a very good user interface for those of you who just want a good interface to start with. Ubuntu Mate is a flavor of Ubuntu and uses Mate as its desktop environment and uses a very much oversaturated green color as its accent color. Voyager Linux is a Linux distribution heavily customized and made to look good and yet is based off of Debian. Elite OS is, well, a distribution based off of Debian. Trisquil Linux is another Linux distribution famously known for being used by the famous person Richard Stallman. It is a Linux distribution which believes in complete freedom, yet does not give you the freedom to use proprietary softwares like Wi-Fi drivers, like graphic drivers, and so on. Bodhi Linux is a Linux distribution made to show how Enlightenment desktop looks. Debian Linux is a Linux distribution which has a lot of controversy, at the same time also has very good user interface, and is of course made by the developers of Debian desktop environment. It is a Linux distribution which has a very much love-hate relationship in the Linux community. Knoppix Linux is another Linux distribution based off of Debian. Yeah, that's it. Kaizen Linux, I don't know how to pronounce that. Yeah, that's really it. Endless OS is another Linux distribution based on Debian and is very much popular in a very specific part of the Linux community. This Linux distribution has its own user interface, although it uses a very much popular desktop environment. Ubuntu Budgie is basically, well, Ubuntu with Budgie desktop environment. Jing OS is a very new distribution focusing on the blur effects and is also very much beginner friendly. Raspberry Pi OS is basically a Linux distribution made for Raspberry Pi chips. Bunsen Labs Linux is a Linux distribution heavily customized, made to look more Nordic themed, and looks very good with its skin. Robo Linux, also based on Debian just like Bunsen Labs, is another Linux distribution which is made for very old computers. Ubuntu Kylin, simply put up, is a Linux distribution made by China, and therefore you won't be able to understand the user interface in the first go, and also requires a lot of customization to make it look more English. Finally, moving on to the Arch based distributions. Arch Linux is another Linux distribution based on itself and is very much used by, well, everybody who is light enough to call themselves BTW. I use Arch. Manjaro is an Arch based Linux distribution which is basically green themed and uses the principles of Ubuntu and continues its pathway in Arch Linux. Arco Linux is another Linux distribution used by many people indeed, many YouTubers indeed, and has a good reputation for being the distribution whose creator is also on YouTube. Garuda Linux is this eagle-shaped Linux distribution made by developers of all sorts of countries, and also is a Linux distribution which has gained a lot of traction very recently due to its amazing user interface and also YouTubers making use of the fact that it looks good. Archcraft Linux is a Linux distribution made by, well, just one person and is basically a very much customized window manager form of Arch Linux, and it looks very good on every desktop. Reborn OS is another Linux distribution based on Arch Linux and has a wide varieties of configured desktop environments to choose from. Maybox Linux is a Linux distribution which uses a heavily configured OpenBox window manager as its major user interface. Instant OS is a Linux distribution which uses its own homegrown Instant WM as its window manager. Arch Labs Linux is a Linux distribution which basically themed more like Archcraft but uses a more darker colors as its theming and styling. It comes with a various varieties of desktops to choose from. Arch Black Linux is basically Parrot OS and Kali Linux stuffed together and made into an Arch based Linux distribution. It's based on Arch and is basically made for hackers. Ka OS is one of those distributions who is actually based on Arch Linux but call themselves as independent Linux distribution. However, I'm not here to rant on them. They use the technology of Qt and KDE and make their desktops look gorgeous, and I just really love them. Xero Linux or Xero Linux, popular Linux distribution as you might say from my sarcastic tone, and this Linux distribution is basically a very heavily customized window manager slash desktop environment version of Arch Linux. Moving on to the Fedora based Linux distributions, we have Rizzi OS. Yes, I'm starting off with the least popular one because there's no reason for that. Rizzi OS comes with some specific installation scripts which you could use to go ahead and then set up your Fedora machine. So it's basically Fedora but it's easier to set up, and it comes with some different wallpapers, I guess. Fedora is basically the independent distribution which is maintained by the company Red Hat, not to mention it's mostly community and it supports freedom. Nobara Linux is a Linux distribution based on Fedora. Its main focus point is gaming. Ultramarine Linux is a Linux distribution which focuses to be Fedora but a bit more beginner friendly and easier to use, also has its own branding and its own color themes and styling. Cubes OS is a very heavy Linux distribution based on Fedora and focuses completely on privacy and security. Fedora is basically Fedora with KDE. You can just go with Fedora KDE if you want this. OpenSUSE is an RPM based Linux distribution, is completely themed around green color and is also of course independent distribution and focuses on being more easy to use for system administration. Gecko Linux is a Linux distribution based on OpenSUSE but with easier to set up interface with an installer pre-installed for you. Red Hat Linux is the Debian version of Fedora. It's basically the most stable version of Fedora which is supported for a very long time. OpenMandriva is a Linux distribution which is based off of Mandriva Linux, which was a Linux distribution which got discontinued. And yeah, Majaya Linux is another Linux distribution which originated directly from Mandriva Linux to give OpenMandriva a bit more competition. Solus OS is an independent Linux distribution with easy to use interface and its traditional unique looking budgie desktop. Slackware is the first Linux distribution which is still active under development right now and is almost not used by anybody, yet is famous for being used for experimental purposes and just to enjoy the old school usage and experience of Linux. PC Linux OS is a Linux distribution which is weird enough to be based on both Debian and Fedora and uses multiple package managers, and yeah, that's a specialty. Geeks OS is a Linux distribution which is taken from the principles of Richard Stallman to be completely free and open source, yet restricting you to use proprietary drivers and other softwares. This Linux distribution is also strictly open source, which means that you cannot use anything other than open source here. NixOS is basically Geeks Linux but a way better version of it, allowing you to install non-free softwares and easier to use for your computer by you. NixOS allows you to have your own custom file where you can keep all your configurations and user preferences and use the same file every time you go around installing NixOS. Wide Linux is an independent Linux distribution which is semi-rolling and which uses its own package manager. Its specialty being it's not based on systemd and uses its own another init system which it says that it's way better than systemd. Alpine Linux is another Linux distribution which does not use systemd and is completely independent. It is a very minimal Linux distribution and is just like Arch Linux but way less popular and does not use systemd again. Alt Linux is a Linux distribution. Yeah, that's it. Gentoo Linux is a Linux distribution which is again independent. It is famously known for taking a lot of time for just installation and usage. Its main specialty being that it compiles everything from scratch whenever you have to install something, which means that it does not have a specific package format. I mean, it of course uses a package manager which helps you to get packages from elsewhere, but it compiles everything from scratch in your computer. Pentoo Linux is a Linux distribution which is based on Gentoo but has a very different approach when it comes to installation, etc. Funtoo is another Linux distribution based on Gentoo, but the only difference again is the ISO file and the installation procedure. Exherbo Linux is another Linux distribution based on Gentoo, which gives you a easy to install Gentoo Linux. Redcore Linux is another Linux distribution which uses Gentoo as its base and builds a distribution on top of it. Redcore Linux is famously known for being the KDE version and easy to install version of Gentoo. Of course, there are thousands of more Linux distributions which I could touch upon, but for now I decided to just keep it simple because there is a part 2 coming soon. With that said, stay tuned for the part 2 version. That's really about it in this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Smash like so that YouTube knows you're enjoying what you're watching. Subscribe so that you can stay tuned for the future videos. It's going to be awesome, and I will meet you in the next video. Goodbye.